I'm Char.
And this is the Drinking Press, where we present thoughts on tap. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. Each month, our podcast mixes you the best in culture, history, and libations. Today, in honor of the election, instead of doing our usual format of discussing one kind of alcohol and the history involving that alcohol, we bring you a special election episode, Presidents and Booze, an episode about presidential drinking just in time for the elections.
Make sure you register, people. I just registered yesterday.
I think it was the last day, actually.
For New York it was, I think. It may be different for other states, but hopefully, well, by the time you listen to this, if you haven't registered yet, you can't complain next year.
Yes, and go vote. And also,
please.
if you're pro-Trump, you may be mildly displeased with today's episode, but it's still fascinating, so stay tuned.
All right, and to help us discuss that topic, Beck talked to Mark Will Weber, author of the book Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt, The Complete History of Presidential Drinking. The book has a chapter for each and every president from Washington to Obama. And just a little bit of background from Mark. He used to be a runner, even though he's now in his 60s, and he used to write a lot about running. And at some point, his interest in history and to some degree alcohol kind of converged, and his eye turned toward this book here.
Yeah, and in writing this book, he told us that his sources were mostly diaries and letters, which I found really interesting. He talked about the process of going online and being able to do kind of database searches on these old diaries and letters, and how fascinated he was at how forthcoming the presidents were in their letters, obviously because they didn't really expect people hundreds of years down the line to be reading their letters that discuss alcohol. But that was his primary source material, and he sifted through a lot of it. It took him about a year to write the book. So here he is talking to us about the book a little bit.
Okay, I'm happy to be here after I trudged down from the village where I was sampling some of the local beers. But presidential drinking, I'm fascinated what happens when alcohol and history collide. And it was such a fun book to do. It didn't even feel like work. A friend of mine said to me, I want to know what all the presidents drank. And he came up with that idea because he read a book about the presidents golfing. And in that book, Warren G. Harding, during Prohibition, would go to the golf course. Nobody's supposed to drink or transport alcohol. But Harding would habitually stash a fifth of whiskey in his golf bag. And he would take a shot of whiskey before he teed off. And then he would take several shots every other hole or so. By the back nine, he was all over the place. Couldn't sink anything. Almost never broke 100, by the way.
I would imagine.
Right. But my friend says to me, he says, I'm fascinated by that. I want to know what all of these presidents drank. And he says, you're a writer. Why don't you write something about it? And I put him off for about a year because I'm like, what am I going to write about Carter? He didn't drink. And Coolidge didn't drink. And so on and so forth. And then I thought, well, Jimmy Carter didn't drink, but Billy drank a lot and made Billy beer, and his mother drank a lot and embarrassed him. And I thought, okay, that might be a way around the 3 or 4 presidents that didn't drink much. The people around them always drink and make them miserable anyway. And so I said to my friend, I said, listen, I'm going to write up the 3 or 4 presidents that I know didn't drink a lot, and if they're interesting, I'll keep going. But I really wanted to try something different, and I've always been very interested in history. I won't say how interested I've been in alcohol, but I do think, as I said at the beginning of the program, when alcohol and history collide, very interesting things happen. And I'm presently in the middle of a book about alcohol and the Civil War and how alcohol affected the Civil War, what generals drank too much, and how they used alcohol as a pain remedy for the wounded soldiers, that kind of thing. So I think there's a really interesting little nook or niche about alcohol and history that really hasn't been tapped into, or at least brought under one roof. And that's sort of what I did with the presidents.
We at the Drinking Press would agree with that.
Exactly. I mean,
Even though the drinking habits of each president varied widely from Harding to Carter, Mark was able to discover how alcohol played a role in each president's life.
Like, one of the things I find most fascinating about the subject you're writing about is really how the interplay between alcohol and presidents and kind of the backstory, such as that, right? How politicians kind of use alcohol as a means of diplomacy or perhaps as a way of garnering favor with their constituencies. That's really fascinating to me.
It's a great insight, Rebecca, that you bring up there, because I'm often asked, well, was alcohol on the American political scene from the very beginning? And the truth is, it predates the beginning. And in other words, we have a documentation that when Washington ran for the House of Burgesses in Virginia, when we were still a British colony, that we have a laundry list of the alcohol that he supplied to his constituents to get voted into the House of Burgesses. So it really predates the country. And certainly they brought these practices over from Europe, where they probably supplied the people with alcohol to support their political aims or military aims or whatever.
And what was Washington giving to people?
Well, back in the House of Burgesses days, they were supplying people with rum, because they were still getting a lot of rum from Jamaica, which that ceased once we went to war with Britain in the Revolution. They were giving Madeira wine from Portugal, which was big. And whiskey was just sort of coming on the scene there. That was really a very American drink, the whiskey. So that sort of came later with the Revolution and that kind of thing, when they couldn't get Jamaican rum anymore.
And for those of you who've listened to our rum and or whiskey episodes, you'll remember that there was a lot of jargon and different language that was used and vocabulary that was used in that era surrounding drinking and alcohol itself. And that was no different during the revolutionary period as well.
So yeah, listen to our episodes on rum and whiskey, guys, if you haven't already. They're up on our site.
Well, there's a lot of interesting angles to the book, things that I was surprised by myself that I didn't know until I got into it. One of the things that I think would be interesting to people is the language of some of these early presidents in the, let's say, the Revolutionary era. And they had a different alcohol slang than we have today. So they wouldn't say that Mark was drunk down at Ye Old Tavern. They would say Mark was quite fuddled, which doesn't sound like a bad word, does it? And if I was on a 3-day binge, or what we would call a binge, right, they would say he was on quite a frolic. Again, this doesn't sound too bad, right?
I'm going to use that from now.
He was on quite a frolic. It almost sounds like a Disney term with Bambi, I don't know, running through the forest or something, a frolic.
It sounds like a mushroom term a little bit. Like you could frolic on mushrooms. Yeah.
Yeah, that you're out of my area now, but that's
out
possible.
Out of my area too.
Okay. In the interest of full disclosure.
The word hangover actually came about around 1906, and it referred to that feeling of leftover badness, overall sort of grossness.
Y'all know what we're talking about here. Hangover.
Yeah, exactly.
And then another term that they didn't really have a word for hangover back then. So there's this great letter from John Adams to his wife Abigail Adams. It's 1774. He's in Philadelphia for the Continental Congress. And they are invited to Benjamin Chew's mansion in Germantown. And Benjamin Chew was one of the richest men in Philadelphia pre-revolution. And he has every wine you can imagine from Europe. And John Adams writes to Abigail and said, "I drank Madeira at a great rate and found no inconvenience in it the next day." And by that he means I didn't have a hangover. But they didn't use the term hangover. They talked either I was inconvenient or I didn't feel inconvenience. So I thought that was quite interesting. You don't see the term hangover come into much later.
Yeah, I like that shroud of terminology.
So alcohol slang is different for the early people.
Oh, that's really cool. So I was really curious about the title of Mark's book, which was Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt. And he described how it was born because Teddy Roosevelt actually used to bribe his cabinet members with mint juleps.
So alcohol basically has been a social lubricant since the beginning of time, right?
Yeah, and I often use alcohol as a means to bribe men. I'm not going to lie.
No comment, guys. Okay.
Anyway, here are...
Careful if you go on a date with Rebecca.
Here's Mark's take on Teddy Roosevelt and bribery.
Teddy Roosevelt used to like to play tennis, weirdly, when he was president, and he would invite his cabinet members to play tennis, and they got sick of it because when Teddy got hooked on an idea, he would just go hog wild with it. So if it was raining, he still wanted to play tennis, and his cabinet members were like, Roosevelt's crazy. He wants us to come play tennis and it's raining. And to entice them, he began to offer them mint juleps courtside after they would play 2 or 3 sets of tennis with him. And he didn't make them himself. His steward made them. And then he would come out and hand them out to the players, and he'd say, here's your mint julep. And they would say, thank you, Mr. President. And he'd say, delighted, in the Teddy Roosevelt outgoing way that he did. And they actually became known as the tennis cabinet because of that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he used this bed of nice, fresh mint from the White House.
So it makes a lot of sense to me that Roosevelt would use alcohol to court political favor. And I feel like generally people in power, they may be more likely to abuse alcohol and or other drugs. I don't know anyone that's sane that would want to be president of any country. It's probably the hardest job in the world. And, you can see it on Obama's face now, in particular, our current president. And 8 years looks like he aged like, I don't know, a lot. You know what I mean? So I see that. I believe that people in power can use alcohol and other things a little bit more freely than others, maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Obama, and we talk about that with Mark later in the episode. He's actually a pretty reasonable, moderate drinker, but many presidents have not been, which we'll also discuss. And presidents certainly have used alcohol both as a form of currency, as a form of manipulating individuals, like we saw with Teddy Roosevelt, and also as a way to control constituents, which we talk about with Mark when he explained that you could really trace the history of prohibition back to Jefferson and Madison. Calvin Coolidge was actually president after Teddy Roosevelt, and you could see how the pendulum swung with him a little bit. He was not a drinker. He didn't drink at all. And he had, instead, a chicken farm at the White House.
No.
And in spite, somewhat, he let the chickens feed on the mint that Teddy Roosevelt had been growing for his drinks, for his juleps. So the chickens were rumored to taste like mint, in fact.
I don't know if I'm a fan of that, though.
Yeah, it's a little strange.
Mint-flavored chicken sounds strange to me.
Yeah, it's a little bizarre.
Do you, in your book, talk about the politics of prohibition at all and how that came about in this country?
Very much. And it really was sort of coming from a long way off. I don't think people realize that prohibition began to build even as early as the 1830s, 1840s, and this was a very alcohol-oriented country at that point. And you could even trace it back in some regard, at least sort of a temperance type thing, to Jefferson and people like that. Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe were all very pro-wine people. And Jefferson has this great quote that I have in my books, something about whiskey is the bane of America. He saw whiskey as a bad thing. He wanted us to drink more like Europeans. He wanted us to drink wine moderately, beer, things like that. But he thought whiskey was a bad thing, and he got that idea from the fact that, the poorer people in America were often drunk on whiskey or rum or that kind of thing. So he saw strong spirits as a negative thing. He wanted America to put higher or lower tariffs on wine so that wine would be cheaper, and to make whiskey less accessible. He saw it as a bad thing. So even back then, people were taking a look at, certain liquors being more, how can I say, negative than wine. He wanted us to drink like Europeans, moderately and with dinner and that kind of thing, and after dinner, for philosophical reasons, but not to get drunk. And whiskey certainly takes us another direction,
And why was whiskey cheaper? Was it because it was homegrown?
Yes, it was so easy to make. And, people like Jefferson were trying like mad to grow wine over here, but they couldn't really do it. They had very minimal success because of blights and things they didn't understand at the time. We've since figured that out, obviously. The state of California is quite glad of that. Other places.
I think everywhere has. I think
pretty
all
much,
states have
yeah.
wine
I think
now.
almost
Yeah.
every state is growing some kind of wine. But back in Jefferson's day, they had very minimal success. There was some very sort of hardy, natural grapes that made wine, but they weren't great tasting wines like Europe, So, but the whiskey thing was quite easy to do. And what people don't realize is that Washington made and sold whiskey. Andrew Jackson made and sold whiskey.
This was during their tenure?
Yes,
Oh.
or directly after. What's really interesting with Washington, in fact, is that he suppresses the whiskey rebellion, and about 2 or 3 years later, he goes into the whiskey business. And we know exactly when he did because of his letters, which are fascinating. When you read them, he writes to a friend and says, Mr. Anderson, who was his Scottish overseer and knew how to make whiskey, says that I can find my account in this. And by that, he meant make money. And it was one of the most profitable items on the Mount Vernon plantation. And at one point, he had 5 stills operating full blast, and they would sell the whiskey off the backs of wagons in Alexandria. And it was quite profitable for him.
Oh, wow.
Andrew Jackson, the same thing. They had whiskey at the Hermitage and his other properties in Tennessee. And on the frontier, they would often use it as almost a currency. So when you read some of Andrew Jackson's letters, you'll see a letter from back to a man who made him a handmade pair of dueling pistols. Jackson was fond of dueling, by the way. And he says, stop by the whiskey still and help yourself to as much whiskey as you may need or require. And it was quite obvious that he was swapping whiskey for the pistols. So, there's probably not a lot of countries in the world that can claim that they're world leaders dealt in whiskey. It's very interesting.
And in talking more about prohibition, I think the really interesting thing that comes to the forefront is kind of the hypocrisy of a lot of the politicians, and in particular President Harding, who was one of the presidents who was president during the time of prohibition. And guess what, guys? He drank too, all right? And I think that's it's a separation of people in power versus the people being oppressed, right? I mean, we had at that time, prohibition agents actually cracking down on local, saloons or speakeasies, as you might call them, and meanwhile, people in power, at the Capitol, and at all levels, were drinking alcohol behind closed doors.
Harding was, as you said, a huge drinker, and he was president during the Prohibition. He actually was not the president who started Prohibition. That was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson didn't want Prohibition to come into existence. He actually vetoed it, but his veto was overridden by Congress, who voted for it despite his vote.
Doing your job, huh, Congress?
Yeah, doing their job, which they're not anymore, but not in the best way. So here's Mark a little bit on Harding and his shameless drinking.
So Coolidge was, to his credit, I guess, he was one of the few presidents that actually towed the line on prohibition. He didn't drink during the his stint in the White House or barely drank, where Harding shamelessly courted the dry vote, in other words, the prohibition people, got elected, drank all the time, and bragged to his friends that he could make a champagne cocktail as good as the guy at the Waldorf Astoria. So he was a hypocrite, Harding. I mean, he got elected with the help of the anti-drinking people and then drank the whole time, regardless, through horrendous parties, at the White House, poker games, and he had the First Lady bustle about and freshen drinks and that kind of thing. They'd say, well, her nickname, Florence Harding's nickname was a Duchess. They'd say, Duchess, get over here, I need another drink. Can you imagine one of our modern First Ladies doing that? And during a poker game, he once lost an entire set of china on the flip of a card. So Harding was a loose cannon and a good guy by sort of men's standards, but not presidential material by any stretch.
Do you think the public was aware?
Vaguely, the public was very much in the dark back in those days. I mean, nowadays you do something like that and you're on YouTube, and an hour later, at the golf course, so the caddy would have got him on his iPhone, and that would have been it. But back in that day, there was so much innuendo, and just I think the people were quite a bit in the dark or wanted to be in the dark. But Coolidge, to his credit, did toe the line on that. He was not a big drinker. Hoover is interesting because Hoover was a big prohibition guy, Herbert Hoover, and he once got booed out of the stadium in Philadelphia. He went to the World Series in 1932, and they're in the midst of the Depression. Nobody's supposed to drink, and they announce him, and he comes into the stadium, and all of a sudden, the fans, after a very light applause, they start a chant, "We want beer. We want beer," and it sweeps the entire stadium. And the poor guy writes about it in his diary. You can read it. He says, "I left the stadium with the chant of 'We want beer' ringing in my ears." But Hoover, they said, he had done a lot of work for Belgium after World War I, helping them get food after the war. So they said that he would, when he wanted to drink, he would stop at the Belgian embassy. So technically he wasn't on U.S. soil, and he would have a cocktail, and then he'd go back to the White House. I don't know if that's positively true, but that was the rumor about Hoover. And of course, FDR comes on and says, enough of this nonsense, let's repeal, and it helped him get elected, I believe.
And one of the themes that continues to repeat itself is that presidents and drinking, they use it for basically to manipulate politics and to maneuver politics as well.
The alcohol is always sort of on the outskirts of these political things, and you can't totally disregard it. And it sort of is a double-edged sword. You don't want to be seen as too prim and proper or a non-drinker these days, and yet you don't want to seem like an alcoholic. And a lot of times you'll use it against your opponent if they drink too much. Alcohol is a double-edged sword and has been for centuries. We go back to William Henry Harrison, for instance, when he ran on the log cabin and hard cider campaign. That was his actual campaign. And not only they used the hard cider thing to show that William Henry Harrison was one of the people, because these bumpkins on the frontier were all drinking hard cider and whiskey, by the way. And they even flipped it on Van Buren, his opponent, and made him sound like the champagne-sipping aristocrat, So it was sort of a class warfare thing. This is 1840 we're talking about. So that this whole thing about what you drank and how much you drank has always been prominent.
And you see this a lot with the current candidates today, right? I mean, if a candidate's seen drinking really, really fancy champagne, the image that they put out is that, well, they're a little bit more high class, maybe not of the people, not of the salt of the earth type of guy, versus if someone's seen drinking a beer and having a burger and some fries, like very often I've seen President Obama like pictured in like kind of local joints, drinking beer and having fries and whatnot. So it really changes how how the populace views our leaders based on what they're seeing eating and drinking. And it really is it does kind of sometimes boil down to like a class issue, right?
Yeah, a class issue. And also, at this point, it's a little bit of a youth issue. So, pandering to younger voters, a lot of candidates and politicians will be drinking craft beer, which, like, I don't know if they really care about craft beer. These are guys
Sure.
that probably have been drinking Miller High Lifes all their lives.
I'm a Bud heavy guy myself, so.
Yeah, or Bud, which, like, I can't personally get near, but I'm guessing in certain parts of America, especially with older people, they weren't really into the craft beer scene, but now you really see that very frequently as a way of pandering to younger voters. So it's a social status issue, it's a youth issue, but current politicians definitely still use alcohol as a means of connecting to people.
So I've also seen Hillary Clinton kind of taking back shots and drowning beer in videos, and I wonder if, I like to think that these things aren't calculated, but I wonder if they're at all calculated.
Well, everything's calculated, and that's actually a brilliant question. And I'm going to get back to Hillary Clinton shortly, but let's talk about your question about calculation and drinking in politics. If you remember the last election when Romney ran, Romney's not a drinker, as is Mr. Trump is not a drinker, believe it or not. We'll talk about him later. But when Romney ran, that was part of the problem, I think. Because you want to be a cool guy. You don't want to be an alcoholic, obviously. But the president today has this really weird tightrope to walk. You want to be kind of hip. Bill Clinton playing his saxophone on Arsenio Hall, that kind of thing. But not everybody can pull it off. Certainly Romney couldn't. But if you remember at the Republican convention that year, they made a big point when Ryan went up. Ryan gets up there and says, hey, I'm a Wisconsin guy, and I love my Miller beer, and I love Leinenkugel, which is a very regional Wisconsin beer with the Wisconsin people known as Leine's. Give me a Leine. And then he said, I also love Spotted Cow. Spotted Cow is a very obscure but very tasty craft beer. And apparently they're very liberal-minded people because they immediately said, we don't want Paul Ryan liking our beer. But the point is, if you believe, as you suggested, that nothing is uncalculated, this is at the Republican convention. He's got this in his speech. And I think, my theory is they wanted Paul Ryan to get up there and be the cool guy to offset the sort of squareness of Romney. Mm-hmm. And, the thing about the drinking, whether it's Reagan or Obama or Paul Ryan, is you want to show that your guys are part of the people. You're blue collar in some way. And hoisting a beer at the bar is a very blue collar demonstration. And so I thought that was really interesting. And I'm sure it was calculated. You just don't do those things. But this cool factor can't be disqualified. And moderate drinking is part of that. Not excessive drinking, but I think it's sort of a disadvantage if you're somebody that doesn't drink at all.
So yeah, we've seen a little bit how politicians these days are using beer and using whiskey as a means of connecting to the people. Getting back to Hillary, when she ran against Obama in 2008, she was actually pounding back shots of Canadian whiskey and chasing that with a lot of beer at a dive bar in Indiana. So we talked to Mark a little bit about that episode as well.
But to get back to Hillary, in 2008, when she ran against Obama, and actually was asked to do an article on all the candidates for Town and Country magazine, and I touched on this, Hillary Clinton was pounding back shots of Canadian whiskey and chasing it with a rather large mug of beer at this dive bar in Indiana called Broncos Lounge. Broncos Lounge is no longer with us, unfortunately, but in 2008 it was the bar in Crown Point, Indiana. So she's in there with steelworkers knocking back shots and beers, which, you don't often see a woman in a pantsuit knock back shots and beers, but I thought it was pretty cool.
Layla, my co-producer, and I are both pointing at ourselves.
Well,
Mark doesn't know us that well.
But I agree with that generation, he's right.
Yeah. No, that's certainly true. By the way, did this bar have a mechanical bull in it? By
that I don't know.
No.
I think when I think mechanical bull, I think Sarah Palin for some reason, but I don't know if that's true. But
somehow I could see that, or her kids, maybe her daughters.
Right. Yeah.
So I've gotten off track. So Hillary, you were saying, was knocking these back with steelworkers, and I think that was quite lauded, right?
I
People
think
loved
so.
it.
I mean, I do kind of feel for female politicians, because what do you do in that instance? You don't want to be, you kind of want to be one of the boys, but that's a hard thing to do when you're not one of the boys, at least gender-wise. And yet there's a fine line there. It's just very difficult. And Carly Fiorina, in fact, when she ran for Senate in California, she was in desperate need of the Latino vote, so she went to some Mexican convention type thing and was drinking shots of tequila and said, I think, every political speech should start with a shot of tequila. I mean, it was sort of a blatant, reach out to the electorate, and she lost the election by quite a bit anyway. But my point is that the alcohol is always sort of on the outskirts of these political things, and you can't totally disregard it.
So I just learned that Donald Trump does not drink any alcohol, which I find very surprising, considering some of the things that he says.
I wish he drank alcohol.
That would explain a lot of his behavior, right? In any event, there were only a few presidents who didn't drink at all: William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, to name a few, and a few who mostly abstained, including Jimmy Carter, whose brother was a big drinker, and even President Obama, whose father actually suffered from alcoholism.
Billy Carter, Jimmy Carter's brother, is a wayward brother, and he's sort of like that old adage where you can pick your friends but not your relatives. And Billy was a heavy beer drinker, a redneck, and proud of it. And he embarrassed poor Jimmy Carter, who was Jimmy wasn't a complete abstainer. He was very temperate, and he would occasionally have some white wine. There's some great stories about Jimmy Carter with the Russians, because the Russians, whenever they have a summit, they demand to drink these vodka toasts. And poor Carter was horrified. He's not going to drink vodka. He barely drinks white wine, So he arranged to get a tiny little glass of white wine for these vodka toasts, and Brezhnev, who was virtually an alcoholic, would make fun of him. He would basically tease him and call him a wimp in Russian, whatever that word might be.
And Obama also is actually a very moderate drinker. I mean, I know he's kind of known for being a little subversive. I'm pretty sure he's admitted to taking coke before. I don't even know drug lingo. Is it snorting coke?
You better
coke?
Be sure of that, by the way.
Oh, yeah. No, I remember reading that somewhere.
Okay.
And he's obviously, admitted openly to smoking marijuana.
Yeah, he's a cigarette user, right? He's a smoker of cigarettes.
I mean, which, in a way, also, he
listens to
connected.
rap music.
Yeah, and, that also connects him to people, right? Because most people, I think present company excluded, but most people have tried that stuff in their lives. So it does connect him a little bit with the populace. But in general, drinking-wise, he is very moderate. He has started a White House special house craft beer, though, which is
White
pretty
House
amazing.
Honey Ale.
Yeah, White House Honey Ale, and it's really cute. They use honey from the bees from Michelle's garden, which is so sweet. I don't know how well those poor bees are doing anymore, because bees around the world seem to be suffering and dying, which is very sad. I actually saw a couple dead ones in my apartment the other day. I don't know how they got in there and why they were dead, but the beer actually is made by the White House staff. They had really cool consultants come in from Dogfish Head and I think from a couple of other places who taught them how to make the ale. And it's really rare. It's not in regular rotation. I think they only really bring it out for special occasions, like the Super Bowl. And there aren't really a lot of bottles that have ever really been made.
Oh, wow. So, President Obama, I'm going to get at you on Twitter. Send us some beer. Send us some of that White House Honey Ale, and we'll review it for you and plug you on the Drinking Press.
Thanks, Obama.
Well, Obama is interesting in that he's sort of an eclectic drinker. I do get asked a lot, what does Obama drink? He's not over the top. He does like an occasional beer. He likes red wine. One of the wines that he likes to drink is something called Chaos Theory, which is from a vintner out in California, an African-American vintner. I think Brown Estate is the name of the vintner. And he likes that. Chaos Theory is kind of a weird term for political people to be drinking, I guess. He also occasionally, if we believe New Yorker magazine, likes a late night martini. Mm-hmm. But he's not over the top. He's a very, what I would call moderate drinker. He has that in common with Clinton and Reagan. And I think one of the common threads for those three presidents is they all had either alcoholic fathers or stepfathers. So they're a little leery about alcohol, understandably. And I think they're a little bit guarded about how much they drink.
That's really interesting. So the analysis is really kind of a family level analysis that you're doing, which is fascinating.
It certainly figures into it. And the other fun thing about Obama, we forget that on his mother's side, he's Irish. And so when he visited Ireland, he went to the village pub of his mother's ancestors. They knew there's only one pub in that tiny little village. And of course, they got him a pint of Guinness, and he knocked it back rather steadfastly, let's say. And the Irish people loved it. You know, in the Irish Times, they were saying, "Oh, the president killed his pint. It was brilliant," that kind of thing. So, we tend to forget that, Obama's white ancestors were Irish, and he knows exactly who they are and what village they're from, and he went to the pub there. When Reagan went to Ireland, he had a pint of Guinness in his ancestral pub as well, and he had a couple sips and for photo ops and put it aside and didn't finish it. But Obama knocked it right down and then went up to the bar and paid for it and said, "I want you to know the president always pays his bar bill." So I thought that was fascinating.
And another thing that really surprised me was some of the very unpresidential behavior that some of the presidents engaged in while they were drunk. For example, Lyndon B. Johnson basically just drunk drove all over his ranch and had the Secret Service follow him and just refill his whiskey all day long.
That's fair.
LBJ and Nixon are both very fascinating, and I didn't realize to what degree until I really dug into the research. But LBJ, who is just an incredible character, maybe not someone that we gravitate or love, but he would drive around his ranch in Texas and sometimes 70, 80 miles an hour in his Lincoln Continental and drink Cutty Sark scotch from a plastic cup while he did this. Now, in fairness, his ranch was probably the size of Rhode Island or something, so he wasn't endangering too many innocent people, but he would fly around the ranch. His poor Secret Service guys would have to follow him in a car. When he wanted more alcohol, he would stop and he'd shake his cup out the window, and the Secret Service guys would have to run up and refill it. And there's a story I don't really want to go into, but he'd also have to stop to relieve himself, and they would have to jump out of their car and shield him, even though they're in this remote ranch. But you can imagine it was not that long after Kennedy had been assassinated. So they had to jump out and shield him, and then he'd jump back in the car, and they would go around the ranch again. For a little riff on that thing, he had an amphibious car, and sometimes he would have people in the car, and he'd bop over this hill down towards this big lake, and they wouldn't know the car was amphibious, and he would say, "I got no brakes," and he'd plunge into the lake, and these people would be freaking out, and then he'd laugh, So he just did these incredible weird things on his ranch, drinking and driving.
Sounds like a frat boy.
Oh, he was like a frat boy. And then Nixon is the other extreme. And what people don't realize about Richard Nixon is he was kind of a lightweight. So by his second glass of wine, he would be slurring his words. And during Watergate, he'd be drunk dialing and things like that. So I'm often asked when I give talks on the subject if the country was ever in danger from a president that drank too much. And there was a time during the Suez Crisis where the British Prime Minister was desperate to get a hold of Nixon. And he called, and you can call this up and listen to it on YouTube or something. And you have this recording of Snowcroft, who was one of Nixon's aides, calling Kissinger. And he says, the British Prime Minister is on the phone and he wants to talk to the president right away. And you hear Kissinger go, "Well, I was just with the president and he was loaded. Can we tell him to call back tomorrow?" And instead of Snowcroft going, "What do you mean the president's loaded?" He says, "Oh, okay, I'll tell him." So it leads me to believe it wasn't the only time. So there's an international crisis and Nixon drank too much and they have to call back the next day. So those two are fascinating. And when Nixon went to China, his people were just petrified because the Chinese have this very volatile liquor called Mai Tai. It's made out of sorghum, and it's like 110 proof, 120, so more than vodka. Very powerful. Dan Rather referred to it as drinking liquid razor blades, so it's very disgusting stuff. And Nixon's aides were scared to death because they would have to drink these things in toasts and such. As it turned out, Chou En-lai poured some in a saucer and lit it on fire to show Nixon how powerful it was. Nixon thought this was great, and he took it back and was showing off with one of his daughters at the White House and almost set the tablecloth on fire at the White House. So they used to joke with Chou En-lai that your Mai Tai almost burned down the White House.
There was also a darker side of presidential drinking. In addition to Nixon, who was mixing pills and drinking during the Watergate period to cope with stress, President Franklin Pierce actually had a really tragic story and died of an alcohol-related illness.
Nobody knows much about Franklin Pierce, but Franklin Pierce died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was one of our pre-Civil War presidents. But Pierce had a very sad life in that he lost two of his children before they even turned 2, and they finally had a boy that lived to like 10, and they doted on this boy. He was this good-looking kid, Benny, they called him, and right before he takes possession of the White House, and he's been elected, but he hasn't been inaugurated yet. But in that time period, they're in a horrific train crash, and the only person killed in the train wreck is his remaining son. And poor Pierce had to carry the body of the son back up a snowbank. And his wife was very zealous about religion, and she got it in her head that God was punishing them because her husband had accepted the presidency. So she spent most of the presidency as a recluse up in the bedroom writing letters to the dead son. So if that doesn't make you want to drink, I don't know what would. So I always sort of stick up for Pierce when people go, "Oh yeah, well, Pierce was a drunk, right?" And I go, well, Pierce probably had reason to drink if you believe that in those things that alcohol can be some sort of relief. So I always have this sort of feeling for Pierce. The other thing about those early presidents is we forget that sometimes they were in college at age 15 or 16, and they were already drinking in their mid-teens, And that was Pierce's case. He went to Bowdoin College in Maine, this very illustrious college even in his day. And one of his friends was Hawthorne, the writer, but he was older, and he would go to the tavern with Hawthorne. So at 16, Franklin Pierce was always already, well on his way to drinking in the tavern. And when his party didn't renominate him to run, there's a quote that's attributed to him where he said, "There's nothing for an ex-president to do but drink."
So when I first heard this story of Franklin Pierce from Mark, I really was so saddened. I remember sitting recording with him and getting goosebumps. It's just so sad. And really, as a podcast who focuses on alcohol, something in the back of my mind, even though we try to make this podcast fun and light and obviously don't encourage drinking to excess, but one of the darker sides to drinking is that there could be this excess. But Franklin Pierce's story is so sad, and it's so nuanced in how much tragedy he suffered and what he was driven to from that suffering. So that was really, even though it was a really sad note in the interview, it was one of my favorite things to learn, and kind of shows you not to judge a man or a human being by the cover. So definitely check out Mark's book. It's full of fascinating stories for each president, just like the stories you've heard today.
I have a Twitter handle, but I so rarely use it. But I do have an author's page on Facebook. If you go to Mark Will Weber author, I post a lot of things about presidential drinking on that page. Presidential birthdays, repeal day, that kind of thing. We get into just short little fun posts with pictures and such about drinking politicians and presidents and that kind of thing.
Okay. You say we. Are you the primary author on the page, or is someone doing it?
I am, but I have handlers because I'm so pathetic at computers and such. I'm so old school, I'd still be sending smoke signals. So people laugh at me, but I actually sent my first text this year.
Oh, wow.
I had never sent a text before, and my daughter sort of shamed me into it, so I finally sent a text, so I'm quite proud of that.
Was it to your daughter?
I don't know if it was to her. It may have been. So it was either to somebody in the family for sure.
Did you sign it "Dear whoever, from Mark"?
I think it was kind of like, did you get that? Did that go through? Did you see my smoke signal? Yeah, I'm really pathetic. So it's amazing that I was able to locate you today to get here.
Well, you are here, and we thank you so much for being here.
It was really great, and enjoyed it so much. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, guys, thanks for tuning in today. Please like our Facebook page, The Drinking Press, and follow us on Twitter at drinking_press. You can follow me, Char, at drinkpresschar.
And me, Beck, at drinkpressbeck, although to be honest, I don't really Twitter that much, but still, you could follow me.
Just follow us anyway. I'm sure we'll get some juicy tidbits from Rebecca's social life. We wanted to also give a great thank you to Mark Will Weber for speaking to us on our podcast today, and our co-producer, Leila Tabatabai.
Yeah, and guys, please don't forget, go vote. It's
Whatever your
really,
opinions
really important. Yeah, and
exercise that franchise, please, guys.
And drink responsibly, unlike the presidents. Adios.
See ya.